So hello and welcome to Culloden Battlefield Visitor Centre. My name's Connell and I'll be your tour guide for the next 50 minutes or so. We'll spend the duration of that time on the battlefield itself, stopping at the main points of interest and delving into the history. So without further ado, we're gathered here today on hallowed ground. On the 16th of April 1746, this stretch of moorland bore witness to the last pitched battle fought on British soil. The Battle of Culloden was the final bloody conclusion to a series of civil wars that had plagued the British Isles for over a half century, known as the Jacobite Risings. Our story, however, begins 61 years earlier, in the year 1685, with the coronation of a new British monarch, King James II. Now, King James belongs to the royal Stuart dynasty. This was a family that had ruled over Britain for close to 80 years by this point. However, it would all come crashing down during James's calamitous tenure as king. He was never a popular monarch with his people or his parliament, and that was largely down to the fact that he was a devout Roman Catholic convert ruling over a fiercely and overwhelmingly Protestant nation. In the 17th century, that is a recipe for disaster. The country were not terribly pleased with their Catholic king, but they were willing to put up with him, and that was because King James had no male heir. He only had two daughters, Mary and Anne, from a previous marriage, and they'd both been raised as Protestants. So Parliament were willing to put up with James because they believed that when he died, the British throne would pass down to his eldest daughter Mary, and Britain would get a smooth Protestant succession. However, this plan was dashed in 1688 when James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy baby boy, who they also creatively named James. If you're not sick of that name already, give it 5 minutes time, you will be. King James, in a fatally tone-deaf move, immediately baptised his new male heir into the Roman Catholic faith. And this sent alarm bells going off up and down the country, because now Britain was faced with the prospect of an entrenched Catholic dynasty, and that was something that the political establishment were just not willing to entertain. This triggered the Glorious Revolution of 1689. This saw James lose his throne. He fled Britain and sought refuge in France, where he established a court in exile. Now, as far as James was concerned, he was still the rightful king, anointed by God. However, his throne was now in the hands of his eldest daughter Mary and his son-in-law, Prince William of Orange. Together, William and Mary will spend 13 years consolidating their grip over the country. However, they failed to produce a child of their own. So upon both their deaths by 1702, the British throne is passed down to the younger daughter of James, Anne. Now, Queen Anne will have 17 pregnancies throughout her reign, but none of her children survive childhood. So when she dies in 1714, she leaves a vacant throne with no immediate successor. And this puts Parliament in a very awkward position. The country needs a new monarch, but they obviously don't want those exiled Catholic Stuarts coming back and reclaiming their lost inheritance. So the politicians are forced to get creative. They pass a piece of legislation through the House of Commons known as the Act of Settlement. This legally eradicated any Catholic claimant from the line of succession. Over 50 people with strong blood connections to the throne were simply taken out of the picture overnight. With them now out of the equation, the gentleman who is now next in line to the British throne was a chap by the name of Georg Ludwig Augustus, which I need not tell you is not a particularly British sounding name, nor did it belong to a particularly British chap either. George was the Prince Elector of Hanover, which is in today's modern northwest Germany. He barely spoke a word of English, and he wasn't particularly fond or familiar with this country. But he did have three things going for him. He was a man, he was Protestant, and he was very wealthy. So as far as Parliament was concerned, he fit the bill perfectly. He was coronated as King George I in 1714, ushering in a new era. Britain now has a new ruling dynasty, the Hanoverians. As you can imagine, that sequence of events was rather controversial. The group of people who were the most offended by it were known as Jacobites. Now, the word Jacobite comes from the Latin for James, Jacobus. A Jacobite, anglicised to Jacobite, simply translates to a follower of James. They were essentially conservative reactionaries who, for one reason or another, believed that the Glorious Revolution had resulted in the illegal and wrongful deposition of the Stuarts. Jacobites came from a variety of different cultural and religious backgrounds all across Britain. They were particularly strong here in the Scottish Highlands, and they were united by the singular belief that their problems would all be solved by putting a Stuart back on the British throne. To that end, the Jacobites launched 3 major rebellions between 1689 and 1719, but all their efforts had failed miserably. By the mid-18th century, it was starting to look like the Stuart cause would be consigned to history. However, circumstance would intervene and give them one last chance. In the 1740s, a major European conflict broke out, the War of Austrian Succession. This drew Britain into direct hostilities with Catholic France. French King Louis XV was very sympathetic to the Jacobite cause, and with most of Britain's best regiments busy fighting the French in the Low Countries and Flanders, the Jacobites felt this was their best opportunity for one last press to take back the throne. They just needed someone to lead this fresh endeavour. And that's where we get Prince Charles Edward Stuart entering the fray. Some of you may be more familiar with his moniker, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Born in Rome in 1720, he is the grandson of the now deceased King James II, and he's the firstborn son of James the would-be III, that baby that was born back in 1688. The future of the Stuart dynasty rests on the shoulders of this bold, energetic, charismatic and famously attractive young prince. He firmly believes it is his destiny and his duty to take back his family's crown. His attempt to do that will eventually terminate here at Culloden Moor in a battle that he will fight against his own distant cousin, Prince William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. He is the grandson of George I, that German chap I mentioned, and he is the 4th born and favourite son of George II, who was the current Hanoverian king at the time of Culloden. So what we have is a family affair. It's a dynastic dispute for the throne of Great Britain, and it's a civil war. What we categorically do not have is a straightforward, one-dimensional case of Scotland versus England, as will become increasingly evident throughout this tour. Now, have I lost anyone? That's the right answer. On that note though, we'll head off to the first stop. I'll go over the campaign and explain how we ended up here at Culloden Moor. So the 1745 Jacobite Rising gets started with Prince Charles Edward Stuart secretly setting sail from France aboard 2 ships packed with men, munitions and supplies for his venture. His destination is the Scottish Highlands, where he anticipates a warm reception from amongst the Highland clans. Charles, however, is a lightning rod for misfortune. Things just go wrong for the man, and it happens very quickly when his flotilla is intercepted by the British Royal Navy. One of his ships is so badly battered in a firefight that it limps straight back to port in France, so not a good start. To make matters worse, that was the ship that contained almost all the volunteers that he brought for the Rising. So when he finally did set foot on British soil, landing on the remote island of Eriskay in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, he did so with only 7 companions. Hardly much of an army. In fact, I'm looking at more of an army in front of me right now than Charles pitched up here with. As you can imagine, the clan chiefs that had gathered to welcome him were less than impressed with this show of force. One of them bluntly told Charles to simply go home. Charles offered the fabled response of, "I am come home." He was a single-minded and determined young prince. He wasn't going to give up that easily. He used all of his charm and charisma to try and entice the support from the Highland clans. He argued that Britain was a tinderbox ready to ignite, believing that the Hanoverians were so unpopular that his subjects were bound to welcome him back as the hero of an unhappy people. Charles also promised that his venture would be supported by King Louis in the form of a regular and professionally trained French army landing here in Britain. This was a crucial prerequisite to getting the support from many Jacobites who'd been involved in those previous failed risings. They understood in no uncertain terms that without bold and swift foreign intervention, their chances of success were very slim indeed. With these promises made, Prince Charles on the 19th of August 1745 at a place called Glenfinnan unfurled the Royal Stuart standard and made his call to arms. And it was answered by about 1,500 men who came marching down the hills and glens to gather at Glenfinnan. Charles finally had the army he so desperately desired. It is, however, important to note that the estimated fighting strength of the Scottish Highlands was anywhere from 33 to 36,000 strong. So the fact that only 1,500 blokes show up gives you a bit of an idea as to how little appetite there actually was for another Jacobite rising. Charles was undeterred by this underwhelming response, however, and he seized the initiative. He struck out the Central Highlands with the small nucleus of an army and marched on Edinburgh, Scotland's historic capital and its largest city at the time. On the 17th of September, this Jacobite army walked into Edinburgh virtually unopposed. Without firing a single shot, they had secured Scotland's most strategic settlement. It was a very encouraging sign for the Jacobites. However, 4 days later, they would face their first major obstacle, as a government army loyal to King George was beginning to concentrate near the town of Prestonpans. Now, 18th century warfare on the surface can sometimes seem like a bit of a silly affair. Armies drawing neat lines and politely exchanging volleys of musket fire all day long until one side's had enough and goes home. That's how you conventionally fight in the 18th century. The Jacobites, however, were not a conventional force. They were broadly a civilian army. The men lacked the professional training and discipline that's required to stand and engage in protracted exchanges of musketry. The bulk of the army also came from the Scottish Highlands, and the Highlanders had their own approach to warfare, which relied very heavily on something known as the Highland Charge. This was a battlefield tactic derived from inter-clan warfare in the rugged landscape of the Highlands, and it involves rushing forwards at pace, delivering a close-range volley, and then following that up with cold steel, bayonets and broadswords drawn. It was all about bravado. It was in essence a psychological tactic designed to invoke terror in the enemy ranks, and that's precisely what it achieved at Prestonpans. Despite facing a larger and essentially professional government army, many of the regiments in that army were filled with raw recruits who had never fought in a battle before. When they were confronted by this terrifying spectacle of the Highland Charge coming at them through the early morning mist, they tucked tail and they ran. The Battle of Prestonpans was a complete and utter farce. It lasted less than 20 minutes and it handed the Jacobites a contemptuously easy victory. Their morale and their confidence skyrocketed, and there was no doubt in Charles's mind about what it was time to do now: march on London. He would need to seize and hold the British capital in order to truly topple the Hanoverian regime. So the Jacobites in October abandon Edinburgh and start to march down the west coast of England. They meet little resistance as they capture towns like Carlisle, Preston, Manchester, and remarkably, by the 4th of December, they have made it as far south as Derby, which is only 120 odd miles from London, about a 5 or 6 day march. There is genuine panic in the capital. It's very lightly defended, and there's a real question as to whether or not they'll be able to protect it from the Jacobites. King George is even making preparations for the treasury to be carried off abroad. There is, however, also panic in the Jacobites' headquarters, and that's because things are not as good as they first appear. First of all, recruitment has been awful. The Jacobite army has only grown to about 5,500 strong. The population are not coming out in support as Charles had anticipated, and this army is woefully inadequate for the task ahead. To make matters worse, there's no sign of this major French invasion force. To the Jacobites, it appears that this crucial prerequisite has just failed to materialise. There's now two much larger government armies rapidly descending on London, and they're concerned about being caught between them. This dire strategic picture convinced almost all of the Jacobite high command that retreat was their only sensible option. When they confronted Charles with this verdict, the prince, however, was dumbfounded. Imbued with all the rashness of youth, and having never lost a battle, he simply could not comprehend retreat at this critical juncture when victory seemed within reach. They had a bitter and acrimonious debate about what to do next, after which Charles was forced to acquiesce to their concerns, and he took what must have been an agonising decision, evermore considering himself betrayed by his officers, to turn his army around and march back north. And so the Jacobites begin a very long, demoralising retreat back to Scotland, and they are followed each step of the way by Prince William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. Now, unlike Charles, whose prior military experience amounted to several days' attendance at a siege when he was only 13, the Duke of Cumberland was a different story. He was a military man. He was only 24 years old at this stage, but he already had a career leading large British and coalition armies against the French in the Low Countries. He had been rapidly redeployed to Britain to deal with this Jacobite threat, and he's brought back with him several of those veteran regiments. With a much larger, better equipped and more experienced army, he pursues the Jacobites as they withdraw further and further north. Fast forward to April 1746, we find Prince Charles and his Jacobite army back roughly where they started, here in the Scottish Highlands. The town of Inverness, 4 miles to our west, is the last major population centre in their possession. It contains the remainder of their baggage train and their dwindling supply of food and cash. Now, the Jacobites have not yet lost a battle, but make no mistake about it, they are losing this campaign. Charles has ran out of strategic options. They cannot afford to retreat any further or abandon Inverness. He's facing an increasingly hard time paying and feeding his men, and faces the prospect of his army simply disintegrating unless he can win a reinvigorating victory. The opportunity for such a victory appears to arrive on the 15th of April, when word reaches him that Cumberland's army has arrived at the town of Nairn, 10 miles to our east. With little other option left open to him, Charles decides to gamble and make a stand here on Culloden Moor. On the 15th, he deploys his army and they await Cumberland's advance. However, the Jacobites are left waiting all day long. There simply is no sign of the government army. And that's because the 15th of April 1746 was the Duke of Cumberland's 25th birthday. And instead of marching his men here to fight a battle, he gave them a day off. At his own expense, he issued them with extra rations of brandy, cheese and biscuits, and they basically had a party over in Nairn to celebrate his birthday. Now, for the Jacobites, who were standing here on starvation rations all day, that wasn't welcome news, but they did sense an opportunity. It was thought, with all the festivities going on in Nairn, that Cumberland soldiers would be, and I quote, drunk as beggars. Now, based on my own limited time in the British Army, part of me is inclined to agree with that assessment. We certainly did like to party hard. So the Jacobites hatched this daring and bold plan to march under cover of darkness and fall on Cumberland's camp in an ambush. It was a nice plan in theory, but in practice it was a complete and utter disaster. The Jacobites were marching over rough terrain, in the darkness and in the midst of a Scottish thunderstorm. How fun does that sound? Their columns got hopelessly strung out and separated, and by the time they were approaching Cumberland's camp, it was clear they were in no position to launch a coordinated assault on a superior foe. And so Charles once again was forced to turn his army around, and they marched all the way back here to Culloden Moor. It's about a 20-mile round trip. The men who find themselves limping back into position here on the 16th of April 1746 haven't slept or eaten in close to 24 hours. All that's been achieved by this night march is to thoroughly exhaust this Jacobite army on the eve of what will prove to be its greatest trial. And we'll talk about that just over by the front lines. So the morning of the 16th of April 1746 is a bitterly cold one. An icy wind carrying sleet and rain sweeps across this moor as the Jacobites deploy for battle and await Cumberland's inevitable advance. Prince Charles should command an army about 5,500 strong, but several hundred of the men are still missing from the previous evening's debacle. Many got lost or simply wandered off in search of food or somewhere to sleep. Charles draws up what men he does have behind me along that line of blue flags off in the distance. If you're struggling to see it, just use that tree line as a reference point. He is defending the road to Inverness, his last stronghold. He deploys his infantry into two main lines. The front line mainly consists of the Highland clansmen, the backbone of this Jacobite army. However, they're by no means the only troops at his disposal. That front line is bolstered by many lowland Scots from Perthshire, Aberdeenshire and Angus. In reserve, you'll also find English Jacobites, Irish Jacobites, two professional French regiments that have finally arrived, and one lonely Spanish naval officer. I always give him a shout out. Cumberland's army arrives shortly after, marching here in splendid order. He's in command of a force at least 9,000 strong. He deploys his infantry in three main lines along these red flags where we're standing now. They are supported on each flank by strong formations of cavalry, something the Jacobites sorely lack at this stage of the campaign, and Cumberland's brought along with him the highly professional corps of Royal Artillery. The difference between these two armies could not be more stark. The broadly civilian Jacobite force is in really bad shape, whereas the government army is well rested, well equipped, and now bolstered by experienced veteran regiments. The battle begins with an exchange of artillery just prior to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, but it's a very uneven exchange. The Jacobites actually have more cannons here on the field than Cumberland's army do. The problem is, they are manned by hastily trained civilians, and they are no match for their professional counterparts in the Royal Artillery Corps. Over the course of 15 to 20 minute long bombardment, the Jacobite gunners are battered into submission, and their tightly packed formations of infantry standing across the moor begin to take heavy fire, and the casualties mount up. The pressure is piling on Charles, and things are about to go from bad to worse. To my right, you'll notice there's a low turf wall just poking out from above the high grass. That is the Leonich enclosure. It protrudes onto the southern wing of the battlefield between the two armies. Just behind it to the west would have stood the Culwiniac enclosure. This was a 6-foot high walled park that stretched all the way down to the valley floor. This, in theory, was supposed to anchor and protect the Jacobites' exposed right wing from Cumberland's army, and it may well have served that purpose if they had bothered to occupy it with any troops. However, due to a fatal lapse in judgment, which is a bit of a recurring theme in the Jacobite army, that wasn't done. Cumberland saw a tantalising opportunity and he seized it. He sent up the Argyllshire militia. This was a unit of Scottish Highlanders loyal to King George to take that position. They breached the enclosure walls, which enabled Cumberland's dragoons, his cavalry, to sweep through the enclosure and begin to envelop the right wing of the Jacobite army. Charles had to pull precious reserves and send them to the rear to deal with that threat. Still under a fierce artillery bombardment, he had little other option than to unleash his men into a full frontal advance. This, of course, being delivered in the form of the Highland Charge. The Highland Charge, however, requires two key ingredients to be a success: the element of surprise and momentum. As you can tell, Culloden Moor is a relatively flat, open and featureless expanse of terrain. It renders very little cover from fire and therefore no element of surprise. At the time, it was much more wet, boggy and saturated, which hampered momentum. The result was a woefully inadequate battlefield for the deployment of such a tactic. The Jacobites had at least 500 metres of exposed terrain to cross while at the mercy of the enemy's firepower. As soon as the charge starts, it starts to go wrong. The Duke of Perth and the MacDonald regiments on the far left of the Jacobite line blunder into the worst part of the bog. These men find themselves knee-deep in water. They lose all their momentum and their advance grinds to a halt. Those in the centre, like the Farquharsons, Macintoshes, Frasers and Stuarts of Appin, begin to veer to their right to find firmer footing, but this brings them colliding with their own right wing, the Athol Brigade and the Camerons. They are trying to veer to their left to avoid being pinned up against those enclosure walls. The result is a confused bottleneck, as the full force of the Highland Charge is channelled and concentrated onto one narrow front. Now these men are advancing into a withering fire from Cumberland's army, first in the form of round shot, 3-pound solid iron cannonballs that skim the surface of the turf at hundreds of feet per second, blasting through the advancing Jacobite ranks. As they get closer, they fall into range of two really nasty munitions of the time, canister and grape shot. Instead of producing a single projectile, these produce dozens that spread out in a shotgun-like effect. Accounts describe how open lanes are cleared through the Jacobite ranks as they absorb round after round. And of course, there is the disciplined firepower of Cumberland's infantry regiments to contend with. The more experienced among them are the best drilled in the world. They can confidently get 3 shots off a minute. They are firing by volleys in ranks 3 deep, which equates roughly to a 6-second interval between each fresh devastating volley. All of this takes a terrible toll on the charging Jacobites, who are falling in their hundreds. The survivors doggedly clamber over their dead and dying comrades to continue the charge, and at 50 metres away they reach the do or die moment. The Jacobites briefly halt and unleash a close-range musket volley into Cumberland's front line, creating a smoke screen which they come charging through, brandishing broadswords and bayonets, screaming and howling like devils, creating as intimidating a spectacle as they possibly can. The full force of the Highland Charge comes bearing down upon just 2 regiments of infantry, Burrell's and Munro's, arrayed exactly where we are now on Cumberland's extreme left wing between these 2 red flags. To their eternal credit, these regiments do not flinch. They bravely hold their ground and meet the Jacobites head on with a hedge of steel bayonets. The lines collide where we are standing, and the sheer impact carried by this concentrated thrust from the Jacobite succeeds in bursting through these regiments. What follows is a brutal, chaotic and bloody hand-to-hand melee, where remarkably, through sheer weight of numbers, the Jacobites punch a hole through Cumberland's front line. More and more men funnel into the gap they have achieved and begin to try and widen it and threaten the second line of Cumberland's army. This is the decisive moment of the engagement. Cumberland recognises that and sends forth several reserve regiments. Burrell's and Munro's men have put up enough resistance to buy them time to seal off the Jacobite breakthrough, which has now lost all of its momentum. At point blank range, Cumberland's reserve regiments, which includes the King's Own Scottish Borderers, pour volley after volley after volley into this heaving, writhing mass of men. Such is the extent and quality of their firepower, it takes as little as 3 minutes to inflict as many as 700 casualties on the Jacobites who fall in this immediate vicinity. Seeing the carnage all around them and that their charge has lost all of its impetus, morale within the Jacobite army collapses and it disintegrates as the men flee back across the moor in terror, swept off it by Cumberland's cavalry. It's all over and done with in less than 1 hour, and in that time close to 1,500 Jacobites fall here on Culloden Moor. Their army and the cause for which they were fighting for is effectively left in tatters. We'll start to make our way over to the cemetery and talk about the immediate aftermath of the battle. As we do so, there's a bend in the path just down the slope. If you observe the ground to your right and left, you'll get a good idea of that boggy terrain they were fighting on. So it's no coincidence that the last two Jacobite regiments on the field offering any resistance are the two professional French ones who perform a brave rearguard action. As professional soldiers in foreign service, they can anticipate dignified treatment as legitimate prisoners of war. It is, however, a very different story for the rest of the Jacobite army. They are British citizens, and as far as the government is concerned, they have taken up arms against their lawful king, which makes them guilty of treason. Cumberland's attitude was big boy games, big boy rules, and he was not in a forgiving mood. He issued an infamous order of no quarter given, which meant mercy was not to be extended to wounded and fugitive Jacobites after the battle. Many left wounded on the field were simply put out of their misery via a bayonet or a musket butt. We are currently stood on what would have been the old Moor Road, which cut across the battlefield. Along it, hundreds of fugitive Jacobites streamed back towards Inverness, where they were pursued and indiscriminately hacked down by Cumberland's cavalry. Caught up in that carnage were many non-combatants, camp followers and even local spectators who found themselves in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Corpses are said to have littered the road for miles to the west. After 3 days, Cumberland rounds up a number of local citizens, brings them here and gives them the grisly duty of disposing of the dead. Now, as I mentioned, this Jacobite army is far from an exclusively Highland or even exclusively Scottish force, and so, with a handful of exceptions, the people on these burial details had no idea who they were laying to rest. The result was mass mixed graves. The dead were simply heaped unceremoniously into large pre-dug pits, and the remnants of them are still visible today, 280 years later, in the form of these grassy mounds that you'll see lining each side of the road, each containing an estimated 100 to 200 dead. Now, your attention has possibly drifted to the stone markers at the base of these burial mounds, bearing the names of certain clans that fought here. For example, behind me we have the clan Stuart of Appin, which suggests that we have a neat, compartmentalised grave belonging to just members of that extended family. While this is a very lovely notion, it's almost certainly not true. These stones don't arrive until 1881, roughly 135 years after the battle, courtesy of the local landlord, Sir Duncan Forbes. Now, Mr. Forbes was a Victorian gentleman, and he very much embodied that Victorian approach to history of don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. It's during the 19th century that the Jacobite Risings are subject to endless romanticisation. It's boiled down and distorted into this one-dimensional Scotland versus England narrative. which is completely at odds with the true complexity and nuance of this conflict. Mr. Forbes also gave us our memorial cairn just off to my left, and the inscription upon it is very indicative of this 19th century reading. It bears the words in memory of the gallant Highlanders who fought for Scotland and Prince Charlie. Now do not mistake me for 1 minute. Many a gallant Highlander certainly did fight and die here. They were the backbone and cutting edge, quite literally, of this Jacobite army. But they were by no means the only men to have laid down their lives and made that same full sacrifice. And I believe today it's only fit and proper that we recognise and acknowledge all those who died on this field. Please do feel free to come back here after the tour is done and visit these stones. Just bear in mind it is an active war grave and therefore due a certain level of respect. We'll start to make our way back over to the visitor centre, first stopping off at the government graves, and we'll talk about their casualties next. So I mentioned how Sir Duncan Forbes was guilty of a bit of romanticism and inaccuracy when he erected those stones over there in the clan graves. This, however, is the most egregious example. There's two statements on the stone, and both of them are painfully misleading. The first one reads, "Field of the English." Now, just as the Jacobite army was far from exclusively Scottish, so too was Cumberland's army far from exclusively English. It was in fact the precursor to the modern British army, and it therefore incorporated elements from across the entirety of Great Britain, which very much does include Scotland. There were no less than 4 Scottish line regiments here fighting in the Duke of Cumberland's army. One of them contained the Argyll Militia and the Highland Independent Companies. These were Gaelic-speaking Highland Scots fighting in Highland dress, most indistinguishable from their Jacobite enemies across the moor. In the rank and file of any British regiment in the mid-18th century, you can expect to find English, Welsh, Irish and Scotsmen. Cumberland even had a small personal escort of Dutch, German and Austrian troops. So describing all of the Cumberland's losses as simply English, I think he's doing them a great disservice. The second statement, "they were buried here," is completely inaccurate. They were not buried here. We've done extensive archaeological survey work in this vicinity and it's revealed no grave. Mr. Forbes just plonked it here because he wasn't sure where they were. We think we know better now, however. Work done in the early 2000s revealed an anomaly just behind that red flag and that patch of rough grass. That's where we currently suspect Cumberland did in fact bury his dead. In stark contrast to the 1,500 Jacobite casualties sustained here, the only official record of losses in the Duke of Cumberland amounts to a mere 50. Now we are taking that number with a massive pinch of salt, based on the size of that grave, discrepancies with pensions being claimed after the battle, and a very long list of wounded men who, let's face it, probably didn't live much longer than a few days or weeks. Estimates do climb higher, but we're talking still probably in the region of only 250 men, so still an incredibly one-sided and decisive affair. We'll continue over to Leonich Cottage, where we'll talk about the long-term impact of Culloden on the Highlands and what happened to our two princes. So behind me we have the restored Leonich Cottage. It's one of several buildings that would have been here at the time of the battle, and it's an excellent example of a typical dwelling for the time. For many Highland Scots living in homes just like this, the battle was only the beginning of their pain. In the immediate aftermath, Cumberland's army went on a rampage, hunting down Jacobite fugitives and sympathisers. In the days and weeks after the battle, a number of summary executions took place. Farms and villages accused of aiding the rebels were put to the torch. Livestock was driven down to the lowlands and sold off to the highest bidder, and of course prisoners were also taken. About 3,500 Jacobites were rounded up and shipped down to London to await trial. Of that 3,500, about only 120 were put to death and executed. They were typically the worst offenders, the ringleaders. The vast majority were eventually released and pardoned after lengthy spells of imprisonment. Many of them choose to join Highland regiments in the British Army and would go off to serve King George across the globe. Over 900, however, were given a one-way ticket across the Atlantic. These people were being sent to the colonies in the New World to serve out terms of indentured servitude. Back here in the Highlands, we have a period of repression and reprisal. This is the 4th Jacobite Rising to emerge in less than 60 years, and the government wants to make sure it can never happen again. In their eyes, Highland martial culture was inextricably associated with Jacobite allegiance, and so they passed these new draconian laws which limited and targeted Highland cultural expression. It led to a brutal period of cultural suppression. Things like wearing Highland dress in a particular fashion, carrying Highland arms, and even speaking the local language, Gaelic, in certain circumstances could land you in prison or again with a one-way ticket across the Atlantic. It led to a brutal cultural recession that the Highlands never quite recovered from. What happened to our two princes? Well, Prince Charles does escape the field. He fled, allegedly, while one of his officers cried out after him, "Run, you cowardly Italian." Run he would. Charles would spend 5 months on the run in the Scottish Highlands. With a £30,000 bounty on his head, that's about £8 million in today's money. Nobody turned him in, however. He slept in the wilderness and in the homes of brave sympathisers who risked their life for his. He eventually would escape back to mainland Europe. However, he returned a shadow of his former self. During his time on the run in Scotland, Charles was going through about a bottle of brandy a day, and that's a habit he would keep up for the rest of his life. He eventually lost his good looks, his mind, and his self-discipline. He died a very sad, alcoholic and bitter man in Florence in 1788, aged 67 years old. A far cry from the bonny prince that landed here in 1745. Fate wasn't much more kind to the Duke of Cumberland. He earned the moniker the Butcher for his role in the reprisals after the battle. His actions appalled even many of the officers in his own army, and his reputation was forever tarnished by the brutality he visited upon the Highland people. He went off and resumed his military career, but it turned out to be a very short and unimpressive one, the highlight of which was Culloden. He never again won a battlefield victory. He suffered a leg wound in the 1740s, which led to increasing immobility and gout. He ballooned in weight, lost his commission in the army, and died a morbidly obese recluse, aged only 44 years old. There's not many happy endings on this tour, I am afraid. We'll make our last stop over at the Visitor Centre, and I'll show you our memorial wall. So I really hope you've all appreciated and enjoyed your time here at Culloden Moor today. If you'd come as a visitor several decades ago, however, you would have had a very different experience. The reason you can still see so many trees surrounding the site is because for a large part of the moor's history, it was private land owned by the Forestry Commission. It was quite literally just a conifer plantation. That path leading through the cemetery, as late as the 1970s, was still the main road to Inverness. People were driving straight through those graves. There was a petrol station behind the Jacobite lines and a tea room where the government graves currently are. So I hope you'll agree that today's presentation of the battlefield is far more appropriate considering what transpired here. And I have to thank each and every one of you for visiting us today and spending your hard-earned cash listening to me waffle on, especially if you are members of the Trust, because it is only through your interest and support that we at the National Trust for Scotland can remain the honoured custodians of this hallowed ground and protect it for future generations. So thank you. Now, I gave Mr. Forbes a bit of a hard time for his stones. We do appreciate them despite their inaccuracies, but when this visitor centre was built in 2008, the National Trust wanted to leave its own all-encompassing memorial, and I'm stood in front of it. Sorry. You're okay? We're not in. You will notice jutting out from the wall we have these protruding stone slabs. Each one of these represents a life lost on that day, a battlefield casualty. To my right we have 50, representing the official record of dead in the Duke of Cumberland's army. To my left, stretching all the way down to the glass doors where we started our tour, are the 1,500 or so lives lost in Prince Charles Edward Stuart's army. These men were husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, friends, in homes, families, hopes and ambitions of their own, and all of that was cut tragically short on the 16th of April 1746. This wall stands as a poignant visualisation of the human cost of war and a memorial to all those who gave their lives on that day, irrespective of what side they were fighting for. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure and a privilege meeting you all. I'll hang around here for a few more minutes. If you've got any questions, please don't be shy. Other than that, God bless. Enjoy the rest of your visit. Thank you.